Okay, I am recording live with Rebeca Eigen and also Arron Rogerson and Alyssa Polizzi that are from the Golden Shadow podcast. And it's a synchronistic event to have us all together because I wasn't sure who would be the perfect people to talk about synchronicity, mainly because it is a daunting subject that I can get behind, but it's hard to explain. And these three people have probably more competence in that area than I do. I'm gonna try to help as I can, as I did a bit to prepare with some reading from the chapter that we're discussing and some others. But mainly, I want to see if we can hear from these three smart people. So before we get into it, Rebeca, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're involved in, and just generally what you think of synchronicity, and then we'll go to the others and get into it.
Okay. Well, I'm an astrologer in Houston, Texas, and I call myself a relationship alchemist
Mm-hmm.
because I help people turn their Saturn into gold.
Mm.
When we look at a blueprint of the psyche in the birth chart,
Mm-hmm.
to me, it is the science of the soul, because what we're seeing is a birth chart with the potentials of who we're becoming, and also our wholeness is also there.
Mm.
So it's kind of like looking at the seed packet of an apple tree. You know, it's a seed inside that packet, but it's going to become an apple tree.
Right.
And so astrology is the same way. It's like you're looking at your birth chart, and we're always in a state of becoming.
Mm-hmm.
What's inside is outside.
Right.
So I've been studying Jungian psychology for 30 years at the C.G.
Mm-hmm.
Jung Center here in Houston.
Mm-hmm.
And my specialty is relationships. That's what I found the most valuable in astrology, was how do
Right.
I explain to people how to have better relationships? And
Yeah.
using the shadow concept really helps, because that way people can do this work together.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. That's some impressive stuff, and we're glad to have you. Arron, tell us a little bit about yourself and that kind of stuff.
All right, my name is Arron. I'm from California. I am an artist and musician, and have recently kind of embarked upon a different trajectory in the philosophical and self-help realm, you might say, but I'm still kind of synthesizing all the art stuff into that. And Alyssa and I have been friends for about 10 years. And we recently started to decide, we decided to start the Golden Shadow podcast in April because we were locked down in the house together and it was something to do.
Right.
And it's taken off since then, evolved into something that's a little more substantial than we had originally planned.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's why we're here.
Cool. Alyssa, tell us some stuff about you, and then we'll get into it.
Sure. My name's Alyssa. I consider myself to be a coach and an educator by profession, working with different modalities, which really sort of shapes a path of self-development and inner work. So my focus is on dream work, elements of shadow and personality development through typology, utilizing the tarot as a symbolic system of exploration. And by extension of that is the work I do with Arron in the Golden Shadow, which is both a podcast, but also a community endeavor. So events and workshops that support an exploration of psychology and self-development.
Cool. Good stuff.
That was way more coherent than my introduction. And way more professional sounding.
No, I liked all of your introductions. They were all very coherent and nice. So in ways of, mainly why we're here today is that we're discussing. I've kind of gotten into this thing of book discussions. You guys do a little bit of that too, by the way. Side note. Oh shoot. this
The
book,
Grail Legend.
the Grail
Yay.
Legend. We're gonna get into that in April, but Alyssa and a friend of hers will be leading that. So that's exciting stuff. I like getting into books, and that's gonna be all up to Alyssa and her friend. But I'll get into some other books this year, and normally I won't probably take so long to like deep dive into each chapter, but the reason I did it with this one is because, and I've said this before, but that people often come, and I'm sure they've asked you three the same question, like, I'm kind of interested and new to Jungian psychology. Where do I start? And a few months ago, I came across this book, and I thought it's a good place to start, being that it's more, written in the 90s rather than the 50s or 60s or 70s, and very coherent and down to earth, and something that most people can grab onto, but at the same time, maybe just outside of the proximal zone of development for most people. So that's the point of these discussions that I've been having, is to kind of bring it down to earth for people. And into this chapter in particular, like I said at the beginning, it's, I think, something that I can read and like nod my head to and say, yeah, that makes sense, but it's difficult to explain. And yeah, so I had you guys at least touch up on the chapter a bit. I don't know how much you were able to get into it, but as far as this chapter 9 in Jung's Map of the Soul, does anyone have any like first impressions or general thoughts on the chapter?
Sure, I'll start.
Sure.
First and foremost, I do think this is a great book for individuals to start with who are interested in Jungian psychology.
Yeah.
Murray Stein is, I think, like, if I had to make a list of like my favorite analysts, Murray Stein is very much at the top as a really just formidable scholar of Jungian work. And I've listened to many of his lectures and think that how he approaches this book is also something that gives people an access point to Jung's work, as it can be very difficult. So with this chapter, it did mirror a lot of what I've learned from him in another lecture on synchronicity. So he's really sort of touching on those basic principles. And I liked how he did kind of split it into that kind of first definition of synchronicity as more of that acausal connecting principle, but then sort of took it into this deeper space, which I think ultimately is very abstract and hard for people to really wrap their mind around, but it at least lays the foundation and framework for someone to start considering the principles of synchronicity.
Yeah, and when you say that acausal connecting principle, it makes me think of, like, I don't know if I'd call it a critique or just something that I would add to that terminology from Jung, is to almost call it a unconscious connecting principle, only because the causality is there. It's just that we're not usually conscious of it, and then we experience these sort of like ahas or epiphanies when it comes into our consciousness. So I don't know, sometimes I reframe it as that makes it a bit more within grasp. I don't know. Did you have anything to add, Arron, before we, I don't know, dive into some of the particulars?
So I was referring to this book as Jung and his symbols for a little bit, which shows how much I actually know about the book and Murray Stein. I read the last chapter though, and I found the chapter to be a little unsatisfying because it didn't really get into the things that I was confused about.
Yeah.
As far as synchronicity goes.
Yeah.
Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist that Jung was working with, I was very curious to kind of understand what about synchronicity has to do with the physics of the world and the kind of notion that there's actually something happening outside of the mind that is synchronistic. And that sort of relationship is still something that eludes me. It's still is confusing. And I do think of synchronicity as being something that is meaningful for reasons that are very subjective. And it's hard for me to make sense of these sort of more
The objectivity,
objective notion of what synchronicity is.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because that's really getting into the theoretical level. And I mentioned this in one of the recent chapters. We talked about how I think it was chapter 7, but how Jung was getting into this right at kind of like the dawn of, getting into what we call quantum physics, and his relationship with Pauli, and a little bit meeting Einstein and some others got him into this. And of course, Marie-Louise von Franz was very interested in it and had relationships with them as well, on a professional level. But it's because it was at that point in time, it was hard for them to really get into the more like concrete theory of it. I feel like some people, like maybe Murray Stein, almost get to the task of updating that theory to today, because today we have string theory and M theory, which much more line up with it, probably compared to that foundational quantum physics. What about you, Rebecca? Any initial impressions on the chapter?
Yeah, what I really liked was his part where he talked about there are no accidents in the meandering and vicissitudes of our historical process.
Right.
That it's going somewhere, and so that we are all part of the cosmos.
Right.
And that we have that little bit of consciousness that is the part of how we complete ourselves through seeing the part of us that's outside of us through the projections that we make.
Right.
And as we develop consciously, then we are contributing to the whole of the whole evolution of the planet,
right,
and the cosmos, really. And so he talks about how each of us is the carrier of that much needed part, and we are all important. So what, it correlates back to what the alchemists believed, which was as above, so below,
right,
as within, so without.
Yeah.
Which is attributed to Hermes Trismegistus.
Mm-hmm.
And that, that to me is how we're co-creating.
Right. Yeah, it makes me think of how, and this isn't taking a side at all on the environmental debate, but it makes me think of how, in that environmental debate, and this is, and by the way, a lot of, we'll touch on what's in the chapter, but we'll expound on with our own thoughts too, to kind of, bring it into common knowledge, so to speak. But in the environmental debate, there's this whole attitude that may be right to, I'm not sure what degree, but it's that, like, we are this, humanity is like a plague on the earth, or without humanity, earth would just be like a Garden of Eden paradise, so to speak. And some people in that environmental debate take that position, or to a greater or lesser degree. However, if you understand consciousness and nature at this kind of like deeper level, then you can start to see how, especially nowadays, where we see like humanity contributing to things like reforestation and the re-greenery of earth and things along those lines, to where there's this interplay between nature, humanity, that is almost destroying itself as it destroys nature, but then at some point it goes the other way, where because humanity becomes conscious of their actions, then they start to like reinvigorate and revive nature, just on that environmental side. And so that's kind of like the interplay, and some of that we do consciously, like in how that we try to be more like better stewards of the planet, and some of that we do, like, we can theorize at least that it happens unconsciously, like if that some unconscious behaviors that we do on a individual and or collective level can somehow like make a better world, whether that's on a nature level or even on a like social psychological level. And which is, I think, also like in this chapter they're talking about the social psychological level. So on that social psychological level, we're always at play in the social psychological environment, and sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously we improve that environment, and sometimes we destroy that environment, social psychological. But the synchronistic events are what sometimes, like, even if we try to have our own agenda, the unconscious will like transform that agenda to make for a better world. So I don't know, that's just kind of like one of the initial thoughts, especially as we're talking about this interplay of how that consciousness connects with not just consciousness but the whole physical world and what we call, the universe. But do I don't know, there any other specific areas you guys want to dive into?
Well, in that way, we're evolving, to me, we're evolving God, not the other way around.
Right.
So everything that we do in the earth, every little bit of our universe is contributing to that, and contributing to the evolution of God, what Ettinger calls the God image.
Right.
As far as the environment goes, it's all connected.
Right.
Synchronistically, it's all connected. You can take an archetype, any one of them, and describe it as an event, as a person, as a place, as an object, as inner and outer are correlating between the psyche and the outer world. So the mirroring that's taking place in all of the things that we're doing is how much we're evolving the God image.
Yeah, and that there's a line from this chapter that I think kind of ties all this together, sort of, which is that it's when he starts talking about the atomic sort of correlation, and that we can it's amazing what we've been able to do in the last 100 years or so, looking inside the atom, and that we don't actually look inside the atom, so to speak, but we can, because the events in there, they have no causal explanation, but they have statistical probability. And so that's how that we've been able to do all that we've done on the subatomic level, and it's how that we've been able to give meaning to our own lives and into history as humanity as a whole, is coming to a better understanding of the statistical probability and looking at things from that perspective. And then it gives what Jung calls, I believe, falling together in time. So it's sort of like there is the observer, which is any individual ego consciousness, plus meaning, plus symbol, plus time gives a synchronicity. So you kind of need all those elements flowing together. What do you think, Alyssa? It looks like you're nodding your head to that.
Well, it's bringing me back to what you said earlier on the kind of critique of what synchronicity is or how it should be defined, which is like less about the terminology of a causality and more about that unconscious connecting principle. And I really do agree with that. I think that's kind of the direction Arron and I took it when we did the podcast episode, because there's something about the kind of deep psyche, both on the collective level and on the personal level, that's really driving that meaning making dynamic in synchronicity. And so that connects us sort of collectively to the social cultural dynamic, to nature, to the universe, you might say. And it's all of those things kind of coming together in a harmonious moment that creates that dynamic of synchronicity. And there is a sort of like causality to it in a way, but it's very unconscious to us. So just what you're getting at to me sort of strengthens that idea of synchronicity being that connecting principle driven by the unconscious that's meant to kind of wake us up to something, some reality, something that the unconscious might be trying to get our attention with. I do look at synchronicity sort of in parallel to dreams as an example, where you have that kind of potent unconscious expression coming forward. And so if it's presenting you with that kind of symbol, what is its meaning? How do you understand the correlation and the connection? And that can be applied on these greater levels, cultural levels, but also on that personal level as well.
Yeah. So this is from the end of chapter 7, because that was a chapter on the self, transitioning to the idea of individuation, which for the most part, that's what synchronicity is all about, is or one of its primary functions is to assist the ego consciousness, so to speak, or the individual into becoming whole, or individuating, we might say. So it says the individuation process is driven by the self and carried out through the mechanisms of compensation. While the ego does not generate it or control it, it may participate in this process by becoming aware of it. So I say that to say that I think a lot of what's going on is, as these signs come in synchronicities, or these sort of like flashes and epiphanies and everything else that kind of comes into like, okay, you're dumb if you don't see this kind of thing, like this is the way to reorient your life, or this is the way to be, or this is the way to become more whole. That awareness helps us participate in the process of individuation and becoming more whole.
Yeah.
My favorite thing about it is the numinous part of it.
Yeah.
We experience
Right.
a synchronistic event, and we know we're connected to the cosmos.
Right.
When you asked me to be in this
Yeah.
discussion, I love the subject of synchronicity because it's always happening.
Right.
I mean, when I was buying my house, I drove by in front of it and there was a turtle in the street. And a few weeks later, 2 weeks later, I got hit rear-ended by somebody. And so I had to go see a chiropractor, and sitting there on the basin was a turtle, ceramic. And then that weekend, my boyfriend and I go fishing, and 4 turtles came up on the bank. So guess who wasn't supposed to buy the house? But the turtle doesn't mean don't buy it. The turtle means slow down. So inner and outer is always happening, and it's fun.
Right.
And you feel that numinousness. It gives you goosebumps.
Right.
One of my clients calls them truth bumps.
Yeah. And what it makes me think of, especially in those symbolic examples like that, is I know we all sometimes talk about how we can receive direction from our dreams, but also synchronistic events can come through dream life, but also in sort of like the waking dream, or which is sort of what that turtle example is, which is you see these dreamlike symbols in actual life, and then just like you could have dreamed the same thing, and you'd be like, oh, I should slow down, whatever the case might have been. I don't know, how did that turn out? Did you just buy the house a little bit later, or?
I bought the house, and 2 weeks later I found out it was raining in the windows. And to make a long story short, I have a huge paper on how to buy a house now.
Okay.
And what to look for when you're buying a house.
Interesting.
That I distribute to people if they are looking to buy a house. There was so many things wrong with the house. It was unbelievable. But what was interesting too is if I had waited 2 weeks, even 2 or 3 weeks, I would have come by again and it would be pouring down raining, and I would have known that it floods in the backyard, that they had had termite damage. I mean, there were so many things I found out after I bought the house, and they disappeared. These they were elderly Asian people, and they disappeared. But for me,
They disappeared
yeah, they did. I mean,
into the
I
collective.
could not get a hold of him. So
Wow.
I did sue the
Mm.
inspector
Mm.
because he didn't find all this stuff.
Mm.
But I also had to come to terms with that I wasn't listening.
Yeah, that's a big thing.
Had I
Go
been
ahead.
listening, you know, I write about it. I've actually written a book. It's
Yeah.
called The Shadow Dance
Yeah,
and
I'm
the
working on that book.
Astrological Seventh House Workbook.
Yeah.
And in here, I tell that story about how I have an agreement now with the universe or God or the Mago Day or whatever you call it.
Sure.
That if I'm not getting something, give it to me 3 times. I promise I'll listen. Because that was a big expense for me to go through, but it was a wake-up call. So I see these things as wake-up calls, you know.
Right.
When I'm working with relationship counseling with people and they keep repeating something, I can see it in the chart.
Yeah. So it makes me just think of how that one of the most important things or values, maybe even one of the most transcendent, maybe not the most, but one of the most, is that we pay attention. And that a lot of people, they may not have ever learned that and been able to put out, you know, that booklet that you made. But because you were able to pay attention, you went through a huge learning experience that might have been a big benefit to yourself and other people. So that's kind of the thing with these synchronistic events and signs and symbols is, so it's like, and like I said, it's about individuation. And so like the house example is interesting because you might be really frustrated then to be like, like lost money or whatever, but money's just like this material symbol in itself. But the like thing that's more valuable than money is that transformation on the inside, which is what individuation is all about. And so it's like if the self or the unconscious was trying to signal something to you, it might have just been like a, look, I told you so, pay attention to the unconscious, you know, and then
Well, I
that
mean,
lesson's learned.
talking about dreams, I mean, y'all are interested in dreams. I had, when I was in my 30s, I had a repetitive dream that this guy was stealing my car. I mean, it just kept happening. It was over and over and over.
Wow.
And that's when I learned about the puer aeternus complex. And that this puer aeternus inside me was stealing my money.
Wow.
And that I was in the dream said I was an accomplice in this situation. And when I got it, I learned about Marie-Louise von France has a book called Puer Aeternus. I read the whole book. And when I finished with that, and the dreams stopped because I realized it was in me and that I could choose differently. You know, that there was things about the way I was spending money that was out of control. So, you know, all of these things are numinous. And when you start questioning everything, you know, I'm 68 years old now. And I started questioning everything around 35, really. Like, what does this mean? Why is this happening again? But the unconscious is giving us information all the time. And so when we start questioning, that becomes, to me, that's when we have free will, because now we can respond instead of as victims. What does it mean? And that's probably the most valuable thing about synchronicity is that there's a parallel meaning.
Right. Because
all these things.
Because what that does is that it's not like we are completely animalistic, or at least we don't understand ourselves being completely animalistic. Whereas, but what, like animals in nature, they can be very easily pushed around. Although we're sort of that way now, in that we can be manipulated by, you know, Facebook and Amazon and Twitter and all those other things. And they kind of treat us the same way. But in our ego consciousness, we kind of get this idea that we can call the shots and know what's going on, but then we get manipulated. And that's sort of like, I mentioned that, but that's kind of like the next level, and the sort of like sorcery of it in a way is what happens with getting manipulated by things that are similar, but not always to the same end, and sometimes even to like a devious end. Like I mentioned, like, you know, getting manipulated by social media and Google and everything else, that they lock into those same things, which is give us these things that might even seem like synchronicity, and then all of a sudden, we're buying all these things that we don't have any real desire for, but it's something on like a deep psychological level that we need to, that like when we see certain, like I was actually listening to like, this isn't a design by one of those agents or anything, but I was listening to Arron and Alyssa's podcast yesterday, sort of preparing for this, on the one that was on synchronicity. And then by the end of it, because they had this example where there was somebody with a Rocky Erickson t-shirt, and so by the end of it, I'm like, I have a Rocky Erickson t-shirt in my Amazon cart. And I'm like, wait a second, I don't really even like Rocky Erickson that much. I mean, he's all right, but so it's like, I think that we have this innate desire that, or I don't know if I'd call it desire, but this innate.
You're considering that you know everything about yourself when you think about that. I mean, you
Yeah.
have to keep in mind that there are two centers to the psyche, the conscious and the unconscious.
Right,
And so
right.
the unconscious in you is what brought that up. It wasn't an accident.
Right. So
So you should buy it.
yeah, maybe I should buy it. I think I
Yeah.
would have if they had a better if they had one available on Prime, but it's one of those things where you got to wait like a week or two, and it's like, why do I have to do that with Amazon? That defeats the whole purpose of Prime. So I don't know. Hopefully I won't like end up in Wish or Etsy for that, but who knows? We'll see. So another principle here is the holding together of the opposites of science and religion. And I know that's a lot of what Alyssa and Arron get into on their podcast, is kind of like hold together that tension of opposites. So Golden Shadow podcast, what did you guys think of that principle, or any others that we've been talking about?
You have to elaborate a little bit. Science versus religion.
Oh, just there was this line, and I'm sort of paraphrasing,
Mhm.
but in the book where what that, because basically synchronicity is sort of like a developing theory, or one that Jung couldn't completely finish just because it's so elaborate, but he could kind of get to where he could possibly get at that time. But one of the goals that Murray Stein talked about that he was setting out, and it's sort of like a goal overall, but one of the main ones is to hold together the opposites of science and religion. And sort of that's what is happening in synchronicity, because the science part of it is that we see in the physics and in the unconscious acausality, there are these signs that will come out of the unknown, or sometimes almost seem like miracles. And then on the other hand, there's the religion part of it, where normally people of a pure religious mind would say, oh, it's God or whatever. And really it's kind of both, especially as he gave some of the examples of people scientifically experimenting with things like ESP and things like that. So I'm wondering what the Golden Shadow thinks of that concept.
I mean, science and religion is a false dichotomy to begin with, and science is a method, right? It's a method of sort of getting at the truth, or increasing the fidelity of your theories. And religion is really tapping into more how we experience the world, and the way that humans actually orient themselves towards each other and towards their lives. It's kind of like a moral structure
Yes.
in some sense. And so the idea that they are opposed to each other is a confusion to begin with. And anyone who is holding science as something that opposes religion is actually turning science into a religion.
Right.
Is how I would say it.
Yeah.
So I would say they're not really separate to begin with. They're actually sort of interwoven and sort of mutually reinforcing. And that's part of Jung's genius, is understanding that.
Right.
Is that the science actually reinforces the religion, and the religion actually reinforces the science, and they're actually not opposed at all.
Well, that's where he called that a new paradigm.
Right.
It's all one continuous.
Right. So I mean, with synchronicity, part of part of the struggle for me is, as I was sort of saying at the beginning of the episode, and we go over this in our episode, is that I can't really get behind the science of it other than the psychology of it. Like there's psychology as a science, and trying to understand what's happening when we experience the phenomenon of synchronicity. I think you can explain it with science, but I can't see it as something. I guess there is a tension there because I can't see the theory of synchronicity being very testable as something outside of the way that humans experience reality, and the way that like the unconscious tends to speak to us through implicit patterns that the ego doesn't want to pay attention to. Like the ego doesn't want to see what the unconscious is seeing. It's just like it's filtering out all this important, fruitful noise. It thinks it's noise, but there's actually like signal in it. So the ego is doing that. The unconscious is actually seeing a lot of reality. It's seeing a lot of the world, and the ego doesn't want to pay attention. And so that's the way I can kind of explain synchronicity to myself. Yeah. And the physics beyond it, again, is still sort of like, I'm not sure what Jung is getting at with the physics idea.
Well, sort of the foundation to all this, I think, is the idea, and I'm wondering what the three of you think of this, is the idea that potentially the unconscious actually knows everything, or just about everything, or everything that that consciousness could possibly know. And so in so doing, the whole thing is that if each person's unconscious, which is a universal or collective unconscious, knows everything and wants us to participate in that, become aware of it in the individuation process, then the unconscious will work through dreams, work through symbols, work through whatever means necessary to draw the conscious mind to become a participant in the unconscious. So I don't know, what do you guys think of that concept, that the unconscious actually knows everything, or just about everything that could possibly be known by consciousness?
I agree. Go ahead.
I just, it's very complex, and there's like an undertone to that I think rings true for me, in the sense that the innovations that have come through in humanity, the developments in consciousness, the discoveries that we've had, the technologies seem to kind of come out of nowhere. You know, the some of the greatest scientific theories are just sort of like born through dreams in a way. We just sort of seem to stumble upon it as if something was sort of serving it to us, as if you might say there was a synchronistic moment where everything aligned and then it kind of moved into consciousness. So in that sense, maybe through that kind of collective thread that we tap into, there seems to be these pathways into this greater source of knowledge and knowing, but the degree of which that's actually accessible for any individual, I think, is extremely limited. And it's hard for me to put a lot of color and detail to that. But I just think on a more zoomed out level, the principle of that feels like it has a lot of validity to it. And you kind of just see these things that emerge into culture or developments evolution from an evolutionary point of view, where it just seems like things lined up in this way, or we were kind of offered something from this deeper place that we have a connection to.
Yeah. Go ahead, Rebecca.
This, for me, the self, which is the whole of us connected to the cosmos, knows everything about us before we've even manifested it. And the more we develop an awareness of this, what Jung called Weltanschauung, or worldview, the more we are going to relate to everything in that way, instead of being unprepared or being in shock or being in disbelief of the things that are occurring outside. We're moving from the age of Pisces, which he wrote extensively on in Ion, of the two fish one
Yeah.
being the Christ and one being the Antichrist.
Mm,
And we're moving towards the age of Aquarius, which is
Mm.
more about objectivity. So the more objective we can get as to what is occurring and not subjective, the more we can contribute to this evolution that's trying to take place. And it's not easy.
yeah.
You know, if anybody tells you that this is easy, they're lying to themselves.
Yeah,
This is
well-
very, very, very hard.
And it should be hard, because that's what kind of like causes us to get stronger and ultimately individuate. I'm wondering what you guys think about the idea of it's not exactly in this chapter, but the idea that, and I don't know, maybe one of you can help me phrase it a little bit better, but how that everything's sort of connected through energy or waves, or the whole like universe is connected, and how that,
Everything's energy.
well, and how that, like, there's a wave going through me right now where I'm at, and it's connected to all the waves of energy that are flowing through everywhere else, including where you guys are at in different places in the United States. And not just traveling waves, so to speak, like the way that we might think of a wave of sound or wave of water or wave of light traveling, but because that wave is in it's sort of at one place and at all places at the same time. We are sort of like all places at the same time. Um, is that something that
We're
you
not
guys,
conscious of that though.
right?
That's
Uh,
unconscious.
What do you guys think of that concept?
I think in the chapter, maybe Marie Stein was getting into this a little bit with the kind of unus mundus
Right.
idea, or even the kind of feeling of synchronicity between thinking of an individual and having them contact you, even though you might not have, heard from them in years. It's like there seems to be some sort of simultaneous connection over space and time that makes you kind of awaken to some sort of possibility, at least, that there is like this thread of connection kind of flowing all through us and around us. So I think even on a really grounded level, we can all consider times in our lives where we've experienced moments like that. And even if it's just a sense of that connection, what does that mean for you as an individual? Does it help you become more tethered to other people, to humanity? It doesn't make you not feel so isolated. I think that's where it becomes extremely powerful if we don't get too abstract or theoretical about it and just use it as a principle to explore deeper connection to others and to the world.
Yeah, although, well, the reason I mentioned that is because in sort of like a theoretical idea of God, even if God is whatever that we hypothesize God to be, but if he or she or it, whatever, is omnipresent, that also makes the thing all knowing at the same time, especially all knowing over space and time, in that if you're in all time at once, you're also, well, if you're in all space, you're all in all time. So you're basically sitting in eternity, which gets into this idea of synchronicity in time and eternity, and that if you're connected to simultaneously all space, you're also connected to all time, which is why that synchronicity gets into this idea of all knowledge, and then helping our conscious minds become more knowledgeable of that and directing our path in that way, which is to become more aligned with that purpose of the self, in that we can individuate and become more whole and more connected to the self. Is why I brought that up. But it sounded like Rebecca had something to mention on that.
I lost it.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
It's sort of
Yeah.
bringing to mind at least a lot of what I feel like Arron's like very core theories around this connection through time of lineage and passing on. We're kind of connected throughout space and time to these traces of our humanity. I don't know, Arron, what do you think?
I like your attempt to make a connection between my
No, I see the
philosophy
connection.
and the discussion, but it seems like a bit of a stretch. What I will say is that the borders between things, like the boundaries that we kind of place between objects, the idea that Alyssa and I are sort of separate objects is actually a little more blurred than we often tend to think, that we are collections of patterns, and
Right.
it's not clear one pattern ends and another pattern begins.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not clear where the pattern of my father ends and the pattern of me begins. I would say they're actually kind of blurred, and that the ego tends to think I am me and I am, that's it. Like, I'm just like, I'm this object. But the truth is that the unconscious knows that
Right.
that's not true, that I'm actually my father, and my father is his father, and his father is
Yes.
his father. We're all the same sort of pattern traveling through time.
Right.
And you can actually see that if you want to get into sort of like the sort of Darwinian idea of the universe, is like things are kind of entities moving through time, these repeating patterns, these different entities that are kind of spiraling off into becoming something more complex over time. And that the entity that I am is actually billions of years old, I would say.
Right.
But the ego is like, no, I was born in 1987. That's it. That's where I began. And when I die, it's over. And I'd say that's not actually true. So
Right. We were probably all together in the 12th century when all of this was formulating.
in some way, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's true. And that sounds kind of goofy, but I do think you can actually get into the science of it, and you can actually demonstrate this is in fact, there's truth to this idea. But
the very first time I ever heard the statement, as above, so below, I remember I was thinking about this yesterday. I was sitting in the Unity Church, and it was one of the first few times I'd gone there, and somebody said that, and it just so resonated with me, and I had no idea. I didn't know what that was. And about a year later, I picked up a book by Liz Green, who's the world's most famous astrologer, and she's also a Jungian analyst. She's the only astrologer who is a Zurich-trained Jungian analyst. And she has an entire chapter in there on alchemy. And I read it, and it was like, there it was. And I had just heard that at the church. So I devoured that book. And then a dream occurred where I was in a huge, I had written it down because I keep journals. I've been keeping journals since I was 18. I have boxes of journals. And a dream occurred 2 years prior that I was in a huge place, and that there were all these people in medieval clothes. And there was an altar, and there were symbols on the altar, but they were alchemical symbols that I didn't recognize, but I wrote them in my journal. So when I started studying with Liz Green and I saw the alchemical symbols, I was like, wow. Like, wow.
Yeah. Well,
so yeah, we know all this, and we're also, to me, we're all connected to each other.
Right.
And I think the deepest level through love.
Right. Well, I think the way that this kind of all ties together is that the collective is over space, which it means that like our collective unconscious, our collective even consciousness spans all the 7 or 8 billion people in the world, and it also spans approximately all of history, and it expands approximately the foreseeable becoming history, whatever we want to call it, the foreseeable future. And sometimes that's hard to grasp because of the dual nature of the individual and the collective. Because, normally if we say, what is a person like, what is Bob like, what am I like, what are you like, we think like that person is like that, they're a good person, or they're a bad person, or they're this and that, when those things may be true, although that's more of probably a persona that we're seeing, whereas the reality is what each person is and the collective is all this like dual nature, but also a multiplicity of nature, and that's the whole like idea of the map, is that map maps onto each individual and onto the collective over probably all space and time. And again, I think that does connect to what Arron gets into in his channel on how that, and I forget exactly how that it was worded in this chapter, but it's like the collective is on its own, and it's on an individuation process of its own. Like in some ways we might look at the world and be like, oh no, it's doomed, but in some ways it's improving on some levels, and that's always going on. There's like the doom and gloom and the ascending into higher consciousness always going on. I don't know, but does that tie into what you get into on your channel, Arron?
Yeah. I mean, what you're saying about like the collective consciousness, which is like shared between all the humans on the planet, it's like that's true. And that's culture in a sense, right? We're kind of like connected socially, we're connected through words and ideas and concepts and art and craft. But we've also inherited all of that from the past, right?
So there's the collective consciousness, which is the culture, and then there's the collective unconsciousness, which is the inherited. But go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, like a lot of the words that we're exchanging right now, we inherited from humans who kind of manifested them thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
And we're still carrying that sort of strange consciousness with us in these patterns that we continue to exchange with each other. And, you know, we'll pass it on to the next generation and they'll keep it and they'll keep passing it on and it'll evolve and the consciousness will ascend in that way. So we are more conscious. I mean, this is debatable, but I'd say that the average human is more conscious now. They're more aware now than a human from 50,000 years ago. There's more of a feeling of seeing things and being like, oh God, like I see things and it's terrifying and I can't make sense of all this information. So we're more aware now, and that's kind of spiraling upward and not always in pretty ways of like becoming more and more conscious. And there needs to be kind of like a spiritual counterbalance to that, which is like the wisdom that comes with all the awareness sort of to craft it into something that's more beautiful and whole. Yeah, I guess that connects to what you were saying, but
and just real quick is that the idea that sometimes people struggle with that because they look at like corruption and wars and the troubles of our times. But like just in like I think the past 50 years the world population has doubled, you know, and I think I'd have to double check the exact time frame, but you know, for most of human history, we were stuck at only getting up to maybe 500 million people in the world. And then it just like spiked up in the last 200 or so years. And we'll probably plateau in about 30 to 50 years at about 10 billion, maybe start going down a little bit after that. But the thing is that there might be billions of people doing stupid things, so to speak, or even evil things. But there's probably at least thousands, maybe even however many thousands or even billions potentially that are trying to ascend to a higher path. So what that means is like, you know, for a long time, there were no more than 500 million. Now there could be 500 million where that might seem like not very many compared to 7 to 8 billion, but the 500 million might be like really seeking something transcendent, even if it's just in, you know, conversations like this to improve consciousness and awareness and try to come to a better understanding of the world and how to individuate and participate in it.
Right, and that's kind of like a collective individuation, I would say. It's like you can even look at like this last year, 2020, as like a like ordeal, a trial.
Right.
And I think that the result of that has been actually that a lot of people have been forced to grow and have been forced to kind of embrace
put out podcasts.
Put out podcasts, yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like
dye your hair red.
Dye your hair red, exactly. Sure. Just ascending, you know. And
the ginger ascension.
Yeah. And I think that's true. Is that like the path of individuation for the individual involves trials, it involves ordeals, it involves pain and suffering, but that sculpts you the person you're meant to be. And that's true for the collective. Is that the planet and people on the planet, a lot of them are suffering, but with that, hopefully, if it doesn't spiral out of control and explode, if it can kind of make it through the trials and ordeals, there is a death and rebirth that happens
definitely
over time. And that's
y'all seen the movie A Matter of Heart?
No.
Oh, that's a Jungian film, right?
It's called A Matter of Heart, and it has about 20 different Jungian analysts who themselves were analyzed by Jung.
Mhm.
And then there's live footage of Jung speaking. And the last 28 minutes is profound. Marie-Louise von France is speaking about his vision before he died. In 61, he had a vision that we had destroyed the whole planet and that there was not a lot left. And she said, I have it in my drawer and I don't even want to look at it because his daughter took notes down of what he saw. Well, we are 10 years past that time when he thought he saw us destroying it. I've been teaching shadow work now for 30 years and I'm really a graphic designer. That's how I made my living and bought my house, etc. But the shadow work was always there in the background. But I'm completely dedicated to that because I see that as the beginning for the majority of people who don't know anything about all this, to start going into their own unconscious to contribute to the evolution and subjugate our will to the divine will, to the self in us that will guide us if we're willing to listen.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I am with all that,
Alyssa, what do you think? You were doing some head nodding.
I'm just sort of reminded a lot of the sort of principle or the core of individuation as being able to become less divided against oneself, step more into wholeness, which in turn connects you more deeply to the collective. And that sort of illusion of really being a siloed individual continues to shatter, and you recognize the role you play in the collective sort of becoming, but also that you must turn towards yourself and do that deep inner work to contribute to that. And Jung has so many great writings on that, the undiscovered self, really sort of exploring the implications of when we do not do that. And so this principle of connection, of collective individuation, starts on an individual level, but then echoes out and amplifies and connects you more deeply to others who are also individuating. And that's how we see the development truly of culture and humanity, is by each of us taking up that mantle of personal responsibility, and in turn being connected to others.
And becoming authentic.
Yeah.
Becoming authentically who we are, which is, bringing astrology into it. If you look at a birth chart, there's all these different characters. And so getting to know yourself means that you get to know all these different characters that are within you. And the first way you're going to do that is you're going to project them. You're going to see them outside of you, as he said in Mysterium, through hate or love. So it's in doing this inner work and paying attention to your dreams and paying attention to the people who you can't stand. All these different things are contributing to your becoming aware of what you just said, not being divided against oneself, which is neurosis, what he called neurosis. And we're all working on it. Nobody's there yet.
Yeah. So
it's an ongoing process.
Maybe Rebecca, maybe you know the quote of Synchronicity, but he said, one of them is just that he said it's a ever-present reality for those who see. What was the quote on that? So basically, that the synchronicity, it's always there for you if you have.
There's a parallel meaning. I printed the whole thing out. I don't know it by heart.
Oh yeah, it wasn't in that chapter, but yeah. So basically, synchronicity is the ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see it. Think is how it goes, or it's something very close to that. But the reason I mentioned that is because we're talking about synchronicity in the light of individuation, because that's mainly what it's getting after, is helping the collective and each individual to become more whole and individuated. So how can we have the eyes to see individuation, whether that's in our dream life or in our daily lives? And I know that this is something that the three of you talk about a bit on your channels. is this idea of how to have an eye to see the symbolic and things manifest from, the symbolic realm or the unconscious and direct our lives. So how can we have the eyes to see, I think, is one of the main things we should probably get at.
Basically, there's always a defeat for the ego.
Mhm.
That is the hard part of individuating. It's not a glamorous thing.
Yeah.
A person decides to get on this path, it is very difficult. And he
Right.
says, from this, we can see the numinous power of the self, which can hardly be experienced in any other way. And that's what synchronicity does. We get to see through humility.
Mhm.
For this reason, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego.
Right.
So when we get those defeats for the ego, instead of condemning ourselves, it's having self-compassion.
Mhm.
Having self-compassion for, okay, we made that mistake, or we didn't see that, but we see it now.
And
then
ultimately, I'm sure compassion in general, because then as we develop self-compassion in that way, then we can better understand the other people, so to speak,
I was
quote
going to say
unquote,
that.
other
Yeah.
people, but go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, when we have compassion for ourselves, we can have compassion for others.
Mhm.
And it is ultimately that sense of we're all connected. We're not we're not just individuals. We are connected to the whole. And that's where the collective unconscious comes in.
Mhm.
When we're connected.
Right. Yeah. And like I was saying earlier, there's the collective unconscious, which is our inherited, maybe all-knowing knowledge and archetypes. And then there's the collective consciousness, which are kind of like opposites of the same pole, the collective consciousness and the collective unconscious. And sort of like the individual path is to kind of connect and harmonize and become whole, eliminate that separation between the unconscious and the conscious mind or ego consciousness. And then on the collective level, it's to more unify the collective unconscious with the collective consciousness. But I'm curious what the golden shadow thinks of how we can become more conscious and have the eyes to see synchronicity in our daily life or nightly life, maybe in dreams.
Certainly, definitely dreams. I'm a big proponent and practitioner of dream work, as it gives us those potent unconscious symbols to explore and make sense of. But at the core, really, and I think this is sort of amplifying what Rebecca was saying, it's the relativization of the ego that really allows you to start to see these principles at plays when you recognize the limitations that consciousness has, that ego is not all that there is, and you start to create that bridge, that ego self-access, or the bridge into the unconscious. You allow for these greater principles to start filtering into your life, and that can be through synchronicity or dreams or other kind of fantasy images, or just the sort of deep meditative space of present awareness that allows you to see these different dynamics going on. And that, to me, kind of cultivates the process of individuation, where you can question why you act the way that you do, the shadow elements that are at play that you've been denying, what the dream images mean. And it comes to me through a practice of humbleness and acceptance of self-limitation of the ego, yet at the same time not discarding of said ego, because that seat of consciousness and will is so deeply important. And becoming it strengthens really by coming into relationship to the unconscious or to the self. It sees its place, but at the same time, it recognizes how to kind of have the responsibilities that it does without so much of that sense of the tight control that the ego at times wants to exert on life. So that sense of humbleness, I think, is really important.
Yeah. What do you think, Arron, as far as how we can better have eyes to see the synchronicity to help us along the path of individuation?
I guess two things that I would say is to develop mirrors. It's like the ego is locked in its subjective perspective, in the sense it can't really see itself. So it believes that it kind of is everything and it sees everything until it runs into a mirror, and the mirror shows its shadow, or the mirror shows the rest of the self, and the ego is like, wait a second, is that me? And so there's things you can do to create mirrors in your life, like journaling, or having certain modalities or kind of games, you might call them, like doing tarot or doing I Ching or astrology even. I can't say I've explored that much, but yes, all these things that provide mirrors for you to actually reflect back at yourself, to shine light on like the more complete full you. And the ego is really, it's really bad at handling contradiction.
Right.
It doesn't want to contradict its story, right? Like, it has a narrative and it wants to keep that narrative coherent and say, this is what's happening. And every time something contradicts the narrative, it kind of wants to be like, no, like, I'm not listening. So finding ways to condition the ego to actually begin to accept that it's wrong sometimes, and that it doesn't actually know everything, and that maybe there's a side of me that I'm not in touch with, like the shadow. It's like, I have a shadow and I acknowledge that. And so when things come my way that kind of seem to conflict with my narrative, the ability to be like, I need to pay attention to that. Like, maybe the narrative's wrong. And that openness is really important to develop. And I think, in addition to having mirrors, which could be all kinds of things, I think also there's ways of getting kind of into a more embodied unconscious state. And like, if you're someone who's like highly rational, highly intellectual like me, it's like you're constantly narrowly constricting reality all the time to kind of like problem solve and take it apart. And you need to actually kind of ungrasp and let go. And once you do that, the unconscious can actually start to kind of flow.
Right.
And meditation, I think, accomplishes that. Just being more physical, like exercising, finding ways to kind of express yourself in a physical way. It's like you're letting the unconscious actually have more say in you, in the self. Whereas like the ego is trying to squish it out of the picture. Getting more embodied allows the unconscious to breathe, and therefore you open yourself more up to synchronistic patterns.
Right.
The unconscious starts to see things, and the ego actually starts to register those things and say, oh, okay.
Right.
So that's abstract, it's like,
No,
how do you
it's
do
good.
that?
Yeah.
But I do think like meditation,
Oh, I
journaling,
think it's great.
Yeah.
I think that's great, because if you start to understand the patterns that are coming at you, that they're synchronistic, that they mean something, and that anybody who you attract is your own energy.
Right.
You can't attract anybody who isn't your own energy. That's the only way it works. So what's inside is outside, whether we want to look at it or not.
Well, it's outside, but also what's tricky about that sort of understanding is that, and I made this illustration, I think it was when I did the chapter 7 one, we often see these like maps of the soul, like what we're talking about, of how there's these layers of self, shadow, anima, animus, and all these things, but it's not just in one person, it's in all the people, and we connect to each other in the social world, and it's sort of through a persona level, but we all kind of see to some degree beyond the persona. But anyway, I just say that to say, as within, so without, but it's not just within, so without, it's within, so without, and within others. And to what you were just saying, Rebecca, is that's how that we end up with certain people around us, and then repelling certain people, and maybe sometimes we need to try to work out those conflicts with those that we've repelled, because that'll work out things in us, because that's what brings about wholeness. And I think maybe that's the area that you're involved in, Rebecca, that we didn't touch on a lot and doesn't really get into this book, is the idea of relationships is what can help us individuate maybe more than anything else.
It's remarkable. Every time I have a couple come to me, I will not put them together. I will do one person first, then the other person, and then I put them together, because they'll lie.
Yeah.
They're not gonna, I'll see the chart. I know the chart is real. I've been studying it 30 years. This is not,
it's like a criminal investigation.
Not guessing. I'm not just guessing that you're an Aries, it's really there. But your moon might be in Cancer, which is completely different from Aries, so there's a lot of different parts of us, and some of them are conflicting.
Right.
And so when I see a couple, inevitably their energy is the same, but you do this part of me and I'll do that part of you. And that's how they operate. And then, it seems as if they're complementary opposites. But the truth is that in order to individuate, you need to be a little more like that person, and they need to be a little more like you. Otherwise, you're going to polarize and become two huge extremes. And then, like Jung says, the unconscious will start kicking between them and get them into fights to get them to get conscious.
Yeah.
I think it's really cool. And so when I'm working with a couple and help them to do shadow work together, I mean, I love doing it because I can see they're going, oh, yeah. Aha, yeah. And that's why I created the webinar that I did, because I can't work one-on-one with everybody.
Right.
But to put this webinar up there, it has 6 modules of how to go into your shadow and use your marriage house. Use your symbology to see the parts of you you don't know, because it's 180 degrees opposite. Your persona is your first house. That's what you know. That's your ego consciousness. That's your physical body even. Your marriage house is 180 degrees opposite. So the first time you're going to see it is through the person you are fascinated by.
Right. And you don't know why.
When there's a fascination that occurs. And that fascination is a part of your own unconscious that got put out on that person. You don't even know them yet. And that's why we have so many divorces. I mean, some people, like, eventually they start, coming to the middle together. But a lot of people say, hey, I don't like you. I'm gone. I did that, when I was married. I left. I had to become exactly like him when I left. Everything I didn't like about him, I had to learn. So it's really, really cool to see your birth chart and to know that, we are connected to the cosmos. And the alchemists knew this. They had to hide astrology because they were being burned at the stake during the Inquisition. So everything had to become a different language, but they knew what they were doing. When they said they were transforming Saturn into lead, they knew exactly what they were doing. They were taking the base prima materia, the parts of us that are inferior, that are restricted, that are limited, where we feel inadequate. Those are our fears of inadequacy. That's symbolic of Saturn. And everybody has Saturn somewhere in their chart. And they were transforming it into gold, which is an open heart, which is love, which is finally loving that part of yourself that's out there that looks like it's them, but also part of you, right? And that allows you to love the other person more.
Yeah. So sometimes when we think of these terms like cosmos connection and all that, some people might be I don't know if I'd say turned off or something like that, but because it's like seems too nebulous. But to me, yeah, that has truth to it. But also we can think of that in the way that each person is its own cosmos, and that we're all connected, just like we've been talking about. And so that connection, it spans space and time, like we talked about. And the reason that astrology works to the degree that it does is because it's so has such consistent patterns. And so much of what synchronicity is to see those patterns that have kind of been screaming out to us from the unconscious that we try to avoid. Or I think sometimes too, we unconsciously orient our lives in a certain direction, whether that's to get in or get out of certain relationships, to get involved or not involved in certain podcasts or whatever, or whatever it might be. And we might just think like, and because it's funny because we talk about what we're talking about today, like, the conscious and unconscious, but really that's always going on. I didn't really touch on that in this chapter, but it's always going on, but we just don't always realize it. Like we might just be like, oh, I started this podcast for fun, but really it's like for some higher purpose that we don't even realize, or this conversation today or whatever. So, what do you think, Golden Shadow? I'm actually looking at I don't shoot. I might have to turn this off. This thing's kind of annoying. My virtual background. Anyway, it's the
It's kind of psychedelic.
yeah. I gotta,
It's like amoebas going all which
yeah,
way.
here we go. Now I'm in reality. I should probably scan this. It's from another book called The Practical Jung, which I think I'll get into more. But anyway, this image by Wilmer reminds me of what Rebecca was just saying, and also what actually I need to make this full screen for those who are watching. Where'd it go? Or no, speaker view. Anyway, we need to recognize our shadow, which sometimes happens through, or often happens through, synchronicity. And usually, like we've mentioned, we'll run from it. And then we have to face the shadow and discover the positive. And then we have a pure gold, which is that transformation that we've been talking about. And then it also makes me think of the golden shadow, which is what your podcast is about. So what do you guys think, golden shadow?
What was the question?
Oh, just any general thoughts, because I haven't heard from you for a few minutes, but just the general thoughts of how that we can become more conscious and whole using these tools that we're talking about.
Well, to comment on that image that you were showing, seemed like this really condensed down version of the hero's journey, where you have this sense of chasing the shadow or a call to it, and then there's sort of the refusal, like, no, I don't want to go there actually, and then you face it, you slay the dragon, you approach the innermost cave, and then there's like some sort of transformation at the end. And that's like this inherent archetypal structure of becoming an individuation. So you can look at something like the hero's journey as a map towards development for oneself, and that the treasure that you seek, is in those deep, dark caves where we do not want to look. So, so using like the kind of mythological, religious frameworks that really map out this development of consciousness can help you relate, because it sort of contains and names this process for us. It takes it out of just this abstract idea of individuation. You can kind of see how certain heroes have actually walked that path, and all in like different variations and different forms. And ultimately it's leading you towards a sort of transformation and realization of self, and then the cycle begins again. So
and
just
like what Arron said, Arron said it was a spiral, and it's going like this. It's not one time, and it's not linear. It's a constant, what he calls circumambulation.
Right
exactly. You alluded to that, how it doesn't, just because we got it one time doesn't mean we got it.
Right. No, it's a never ending cyclical dynamic and pattern that we find ourselves in, and it truly never ends. You never make it to the top of the mountain, but you're constantly climbing and strengthening and realizing, and that helps propel you on that journey. So I do think a way of just being able to tap into that process of becoming is to look at those mythic, fictional, religious stories that map those out in really dynamic ways.
Yeah. And it's a good word, map, because that's the book that we're talking about, is the map of the soul. But also because I think it maps well, and I don't think we have time to try to hypothesize all the details of it, but it does map well onto the hero's journey, like you mentioned, and to some degree that image that I showed from that illustration. And then also, like this book talks about some of the universal archetypes, just to kind of get in that initial understanding of Jungian philosophy as a whole, or the Jung's map of the soul. But those universal archetypes, as that they kind of break up into ways that we interact with them, that is the hero's journey and the individuation process. But then also the more universal, like story archetypes, like queens and the innocent and the hero and the outlaw and all those different kinds of things, because right, the fool and the trickster, it's all working towards individuation, and that's why that we identify so well with these archetypal stories, and some of them we may not identify with so well because they don't connect on that archetypal level. But what it's doing is it's bringing something out of the unconscious to draw us up toward individuation.
Yeah, just all opportunities to kind of
Right.
raise consciousness and to see the greater structures and patterns, which helps you recognize those deep connections that are present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All right. I think we did it. I think we figured out synchronicity as much as we maybe could in a one podcast. But of course, this is all just kind of, what's that?
It was nice to meet you all.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
too.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Do you guys have anything else to add on this subject or anything else before we wrap it up here in a minute?
We've got some podcast episode exploring these ideas where I just say like every episode is an exploration of dimensions of this greater conversation of inner exploration. So episode on synchronicity, individuation, higher self and becoming, all of those dynamics. So for more insights from us, you can check out our podcast.
Yeah, I guess we could promote ourselves right now. And take advantage of that. But yeah, we do run a podcast called The Golden Shadow. You can find it really easily on any streaming service and on YouTube. We're also tinkering with running a online community with Zoom events and workshops and classes. And that's sort of being constructed at goldenshadow.org. And you can find us on social media at goldenshadow.org. So cool. Lots of change happening, lots of things in the works. Cool. We'll see.
Sounds like
see where it goes.
Collective and individuation going on.
Exactly.
Rebecca, anything else to add on synchronicity or individuation or your own things?
Yeah, I would say we're born at a certain moment in time, and who we are is reflective of that moment in time.
Right.
And our parents, our blue eyes, our circumstances that we find ourselves in, that is our fate. And like Nietzsche said, we have to learn to love our fate.
Right.
And in the second half of life, now what's coming at us, we can make more choices. We are not in control of what's coming, but we are in control of how we respond. And so this is where we're headed with becoming conscious, that we know we have dirt, but it's conscious dirt. So when people tell me I don't want to look at, I just want to look at love and light. Well, if we were just looking at love and light, we would have gotten out of this problem a long time ago.
Yeah.
So we need to look at our shadow.
Yeah.
And that is what I do. My website is shadowdance.com. I help you go into your own unconscious. And my goal is to help people have better relationships with each other, not just talk about theory, but how can we make this work? And love, that's me.
Aw. That's good stuff. Okay, the only thing I would add is just that, so now I've done chapters 2 through 9, and originally when I started this, I wasn't sure how I would do it. I kind of like figured it out as I went along. And when I first started the book, I wasn't sure about how much it was worth getting into the ego chapter, which is chapter 1. So I'll probably go back and do that one at some point in the next week or two. And then also I'm trying to figure out how maybe I'll have some kind of group discussion, and I might do it in like 2 30-minute sessions or so. But basically I want to have like a summary of all this, because not everybody's going to want to listen to all 10 or 12 hours or whatever this whole thing is. But I'll have like about an hour that'll kind of like go over at least these 9 concepts sort of quickly, so that way if somebody's interested in these things, then they can start with that, and then if they want to go deeper, then they can watch the other ones, and then if they want to go deeper, they can hopefully read Murray Stein's book and some others. So that's what I got, and I appreciate you guys coming on, and I'm sure we'll do more in the future. And I appreciate any and all listeners that are watching live or recorded in the near future. And thanks a lot, guys. Stay archetypal.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Isaac.
All right. Have a good one.
Rebecca.
Yep. See you around.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.